Most cuttings don't fail because of poor care. They fail because they never form roots fast enough to survive. In garden after garden, the pattern repeats. Healthy stems are cut, placed in soil, watered, watched, and slowly, quietly, they die. But in a few small experiments, something unusual happens. The survival rate doesn't just improve, it can double. No fertilizers, no synthetic rooting hormones. Just a simple liquid, made from the branches of a tree most people walk past without noticing. A method that existed long before modern gardening products. And then, for no obvious reason, disappeared. So the question is not just whether it works. The real question is this: what exactly is this forgotten water? And why did no one keep using it? Long before synthetic rooting hormones were developed, long before garden centers lined their shelves with bottled solutions, this practice already existed in quiet, ordinary places. Behind stone houses and wooden fences, in small European gardens, people noticed something they could not fully explain. When young willow branches were cut and soaked in water, the liquid changed. It was subtle. No dramatic color, no strong scent, nothing that looked like a chemical transformation. And yet, when that water was used on fresh cuttings, the results began to speak for themselves. Roots appeared sooner, more consistently, sometimes where nothing had grown before. No one called it a breakthrough. No one wrote patents or built factories around it. It was simply passed on, from one gardener to another. A quiet piece of knowledge, repeated often enough to be trusted. But what made this method truly unusual was not the technique. It was the tree itself. Because willow is not like most plants. A broken branch does not easily die. In the right conditions, it begins again. New cells form at the wound. New growth emerges from what should have been an ending. Some even observed that a willow cutting, left in damp soil, could begin forming roots almost on its own, with very little encouragement. Which raises a deeper question. If this tree already holds the ability to regenerate so easily, what exactly is happening when that ability is transferred into water? And more importantly, what happens when another plant is exposed to it? What makes this possible begins at the moment a branch is cut. For most plants, that cut is a crisis. Water loss begins. Cells are damaged. Survival is uncertain. The plant responds by forming a protective layer, a mass of undifferentiated cells known as callus. From there, if conditions are right, root signals are triggered. But this process is fragile, too slow, and the cutting dies before roots ever emerge. Willow behaves differently. It does not just react to damage. It accelerates through it. Inside the tissue of young willow branches, chemical signals linked to growth and recovery are already active at unusually high levels. When the branch is cut, these signals intensify. The formation of callus happens faster. The transition from wound to root begins sooner, and the stress response, which would normally slow everything down, is partially buffered. In some cases, a willow cutting placed in moist soil can begin forming roots with almost no intervention at all. It does not wait for perfect conditions. It creates them. Now consider what happens when those same branches are soaked in water. Over time, some of these active compounds leach out into the liquid. Not in a way you can easily see, but enough to carry a biological effect. When another plant cutting is exposed to that water, it does not receive roots directly. It receives a signal, a push. The stress response becomes more controlled. The callus forms more reliably. The window between cutting and rooting becomes shorter. And that is the crucial shift. Willow water does not force a plant to grow roots. It changes the conditions so that the plant chooses to do it sooner and with greater success. If that is true, then this is not just a trick. It is a mechanism. And anything that follows a mechanism can be repeated. If this mechanism can be repeated, then the process itself becomes surprisingly simple. It begins with the right material, not old hardened branches, but young, flexible willow growth, the kind that still bends easily, still carries that active surge of life inside its tissues. This is where the signal is strongest. Those branches are cut into smaller pieces, not for convenience, but to expose more surface area. More contact means more of those hidden compounds can move into the water. Then they are left to soak. No boiling, no complex extraction, just time. Several hours, sometimes overnight, in water that is neither too hot nor too cold, enough to draw out what the plant naturally holds without breaking it down. What forms is subtle, a pale liquid, almost unchanged to the eye. But functionally, something has shifted. That liquid can then be used in two ways. Fresh cuttings can be soaked in it before planting, giving them an early advantage. Or it can be applied directly to young plants, supporting them during the most fragile stage of development. And this is where the method often fails, not because it does not work, but because the details are ignored. Older branches carry far less of the active signals. Soaking for too long can tip the balance in the wrong direction, allowing decomposition instead of extraction. The difference is not dramatic on the surface, but biologically it is everything, which is why two people can follow the same idea and walk away with completely different results. But when it is done correctly, the effect is consistent enough to raise a more important question, not how to make it, but what it actually changes. Because if the process is this simple, then the outcome should be easy to observe. The difference becomes visible sooner than most people expect. In a simple side-by-side comparison, two sets of cuttings are treated the same way. Same plant, same soil, same light. The only variable is the water they receive in the beginning. One group is exposed to willow water. The other is not. At first, nothing seems to happen. The leaves remain still. The stems look identical. There is no dramatic sign that anything is changing beneath the surface. But below that surface, timing begins to shift. Within the first few days, the treated cuttings start forming callus earlier. That thin layer of living tissue appears faster, more evenly, almost as if the plant has already decided to commit to survival. Soon after, roots begin to emerge. Not in bursts, but in patterns. More points of growth, more consistency from one cutting to the next. On the other side, the untreated group tells a quieter story. Some cuttings hesitate, some stall, and some never make the transition at all. Days pass, and the gap widens. By the end of the first week, the difference is no longer subtle. It is structural. One group is building a foundation. The other is still struggling to begin. This does not happen every time, and not under every condition, but it happens often enough and clearly enough to shift the conversation. Because once you see that difference, even once, the question changes. It is no longer about whether willow water can make an impact. It becomes something harder to ignore. If a method like this can influence the earliest and most fragile stage of a plant's life, then why is it missing from modern practice? The answer has very little to do with whether it works. It has everything to do with how things spread. Modern gardening, like most industries, does not grow around what is simply effective. It grows around what can be repeated, packaged, and sold. A solution that can be measured, stabilized, and sealed into a bottle has a clear path forward. It can be labeled, marketed, distributed at scale. But something like willow water does not fit that model. It depends on fresh material. It changes depending on the season, the age of the branch, even the conditions in which it was prepared. There is no fixed formula, no guarantee that two batches will behave exactly the same. And that unpredictability matters. Not because it makes the method useless, but because it makes it difficult to standardize. Over time, methods like this do not disappear all at once. They are replaced, quietly, gradually, by alternatives that are easier to control. Synthetic rooting compounds offer consistency. They deliver the same response in the same concentration every time. And in a system that values reliability above all else, that consistency wins. So the shift was not a rejection, it was a trade. Control in exchange for simplicity, uniform results in exchange for natural variation. And in that exchange, something else was lost. A method that required observation, adjustment, understanding. Because once a solution becomes a product, the need to understand it begins to fade, which leads to a more uncomfortable question. If a method disappears not because it failed, but because it could not be scaled, how many others have followed the same path? If most cuttings fail because they run out of time before roots can form, then the solution may not be to add something more complex. It may be to restore the timing itself, to give the plant just enough of a signal, just early enough to change the outcome. Willow water is not a miracle. It does not guarantee success. It does not replace care or attention or patience. What it does is simpler than that. It shifts the odds. And sometimes that is all a living system needs. Because in the end, a cutting does not fail all at once. It fails gradually, in the space between damage and recovery. Shorten that space even slightly, and the entire trajectory can change. Which brings the story back to where it began. A quiet method, a simple material, a result that is easy to overlook until it isn't. The kind of knowledge that does not disappear because it was proven wrong, but because it was no longer necessary for the system that replaced it. And yet it is still here, still available, still waiting to be tested, not in theory, but in soil. So the final question is no longer about belief, it is about action. What would happen if you tried it yourself and watched closely enough to see the difference?